So let's continue talking about measuring disease outcome, and now we're going to talk about incidence and prevalence. And to understand what the difference between these two is, we should first talk about the difference between a rate and a proportion. So a rate is a measure of how fast disease is occurring in a population. So, time is going to be in the denominator here. We want to know how fast it's happening. And time is always something over time, like miles per hour. I'm sorry, a rate is always something over time. Now, a proportion, on the other hand, talks about what fraction of a population has a disease. So that doesn't really take time into account, so it's really how much of a population is going to have the disease. So incidence, that's a rate, and prevalence is a proportion. So first let's talk about incidence. This is a measure of the risk of developing a disease or some condition over some period of time. So here we can say the number of new cases of the disease in a year, or whatever time frame you're looking at, and you divide that by the number of people at risk for that disease. So let's say we wanted to measure the number of new gunshot wounds in Chicago, let's say over the course of the year 2012. And so you would, in the numerator here, you would say over the course of the year, how many people got shot? And so let's look at deaths, and I think there were 435 fatalities in Chicago due to gunshots in 2012. So in that year, in 2012, we had 435 people who died, and we should put that over the number of people at risk. So if we're looking at Chicago, this is the John Hancock building, if you couldn't tell, then it would be the population of Chicago, which is around 2.7 million. Both of these numbers came off of some random internet site. The accuracy of the numbers doesn't matter. We're really looking at, can we do this calculation here? And so our incidence here would be 0.00016, or if you wanted to make it a percent, it would be 0.016%. Now, because these numbers are pretty small, oftentimes incidences will be reported in things like per 1,000 people. And so what you would do to do that is just multiply it by 1,000. And so then you get this number, which is a little bit easier to digest. You say per 1,000 people in Chicago, we had 0.16 people shot and killed per year, specifically in the year 2012. So to characterize that, incidence is a measure of risk. We're going to look at the risk of dying from a gunshot wound in various cities across the U.S. And so I got this from another site, and we look at, looks like 11 cities here. We got their populations, the number of people who died by gunshot, and then the number of gunshot deaths per 100,000 people. So they multiplied by 100,000 to make numbers that are a little bit more, that are a little easier for us to wrap our minds around. So let's look at a couple of things here. So obviously, the most deaths happened in Chicago. I got a different number here, but pretty close, 444. But because we have such a big population, the actual risk of being shot it was 16.4 gun deaths per 100,000 people. Now, the worst city here, the one that has the highest risk of being shot to death in, is Detroit. And so they have a little bit of a smaller population than us, and they have 333 deaths. And so 47.5 people were shot and killed per 100,000 in Detroit. So you can see that risk is higher than we have here in Chicago. And so let's look at here, Oakland and Memphis. And so Memphis actually had more deaths than Oakland did. But because Memphis has more people, the risk was a little bit less. It was 19.38 people died by gunshot per 100,000 in Memphis, whereas in Oakland, it was the risk was higher and significantly higher. Look, 27.3. And why is that? Because their population is significantly less. So even though they had less total number of people who died than Memphis, the risk there was higher, because 27.3 per 100,000, because you have to take into account the population here. So you can see now here how incidence can be used as a measure of risk. I don't mean to editorialize here, but these are pretty pathetic numbers. These are shameful. Actually, all of it really is. But that's incidence. But there are a few more nuances we should cover. We'll look at those in the next video. We're going to look at cumulative incidence as well as person-time incidence. See you there.